A simple grocery store visit suddenly turned into an unforgettable showdown when an elderly woman told rapper Snoop Dogg to go back to Africa. But what Snoop said next? It wasn't just a mic drop, it was a cultural earthquake. Don't miss this. Like, subscribe, and drop a comment for more stories that shake the world. The store buzzed with the usual hum of everyday life. Shoppers wandered through the aisles, some chatting, others lost in thought. It was a bright, sunny afternoon in Compton, California, Snoop Dogg's hometown. But today, the usual routine was about to be interrupted in the most unexpected way. Near the produce section, an elderly woman, Mrs. Thompson, likely in her late 70s, adjusted her glasses while reaching for a bag of apples. Her faded cardigan and neatly pinned silver hair gave her a gentle appearance, but what followed was anything but. Snoop Dogg, dressed casually in his signature laid-back style, a blue Compton hoodie and jeans, approached the nearby stand, reaching for some oranges. He blended effortlessly into the flow of the store, calm and polite, scrolling through his phone while balancing a basket of groceries. And then it happened. Mrs. Thompson suddenly turned, eyes narrowing as she noticed him. Her lips tightened, her expression shifting. Then, loud enough for nearby shoppers to hear, she said, "You people don't belong here." Snoop froze mid-text, his fingers hovering over his phone. As he looked up, she continued, her voice sharp and cutting. "Why don't you go back to Africa where you came from?" The air felt heavier in an instant. A couple of shoppers stopped in their tracks, exchanging uneasy glances. Some pretended they hadn't heard. The usual rhythm of the store was shattered, replaced by an awkward silence stretching longer than anyone was comfortable with. For a brief moment, Snoop's brow furrowed, as if he might respond right away. But he didn't. Instead, he took a slow breath, his face unreadable, carefully considering his response. Mrs. Thompson, still gripping her apples, stood firm, unapologetic. The tension was thick, pressing on everyone within earshot. A young mother named Elena quickly guided her child away, while an older man, Mr. Ramirez, near the potatoes, glanced at Snoop, waiting to see what he'd do. The silence stretched, heavier than any words. Snoop stood still, his grip tightening around his grocery basket. Every face in the store had turned in his direction. Every sound seemed muted, and yet Mrs. Thompson didn't waver. Her chin lifted slightly, daring him to respond. A young employee stacking bananas, Marcus, hesitated. Should he intervene? A cashier, Lisa, craned her neck for a better view. The growing crowd didn't move closer, but no one walked away either. Like it or not, they were witnesses now. Snoop finally met Mrs. Thompson's gaze, his face calm but filled with thought. 1,000 responses must have been racing through his mind. He could shout, walk away, lash out. But none of those felt right. Instead, he took a moment, shifting his basket to his other hand, straightening his posture. His voice, when he spoke, was calm yet deliberate, cutting through the thick tension. "Ma'am," he said, his tone measured, "do you even realize what you just said?" His question wasn't filled with anger. It was reflective, almost as if giving her a moment to reconsider. But she wasn't interested in reflection. "I said what I said," she snapped, her voice rising. "This is my country. People like you don't belong here." That was it. A young woman near the bread aisle, Jessica, gasped audibly, and the murmurs in the crowd grew louder. Yet, through it all, Snoop remained steady. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't move closer. Instead, he let the pause stretch, allowing her words to sink into everyone around them. Then, finally, he nodded slowly. "All right," he said, his voice unsettlingly calm. "Since you brought it up, let's talk about that." The room held its breath. A storm was coming, but not the kind anyone expected. Snoop set his basket down on the floor with quiet care. His presence seemed to grow larger in the space, his calmness almost magnetic. Every ear leaned in, even those pretending not to listen. "You say I don't belong here?" His voice was firm, each word carrying weight. "Then let me tell you where I come from." The crowd was frozen, listening intently. Even Mrs. Thompson, though still defiant, shifted uncomfortably under his gaze. My great-great-grandfather was born here in California. But before that, he was brought here, against his will, forced to work like an animal to build the very foundation of this state. This country. The one you're standing in. Mrs. Thompson's lips pressed into a thin line, but she said nothing. The crowd, however, was transfixed. A man near the dairy section, Tom, had been looking at his phone, but now he'd put it down entirely. An older couple, the Wilsons, whispered to each other, unable to look away. My grandfather, Snoop continued, his voice growing stronger, fought in Korea. Risked his life for a country that sent him to war but wouldn't let him sit at the same counters when he came home. Wouldn't let him drink from the same fountains. But he stayed. You know why? Because he still believed in this country's promise, even when it didn't believe in him. The room was silent. Even the hum of the refrigerators seemed quieter. My parents? His tone softened, but his conviction didn't waver. They fought too. Not with fists. Not with guns. But by raising me to respect others, no matter what they look like. My mother, she spent her life teaching kids about love and equality. My father, a community leader. The kind of man who would stop to help someone like you if your car broke down. He let his words settle before finishing. So, you're telling me I don't belong here? That I should go back to Africa? He shook his head, sadness flickering across his face. Ma'am, I am just as much a part of this country as you are. Maybe even more, because my family paid for it in blood, sweat, and tears. Mrs. Thompson's hands trembled slightly as she gripped her apples. She opened her mouth as if to respond, but no words came. Snoop sighed, stepping back. I could have walked away, he said, now addressing the entire crowd. But what good would that do? Ignorance doesn't get better with silence. It's up to all of us to be better than this. To be better than words like that. A moment of stillness. Then, Derek, a middle-aged man in a baseball cap, stepped forward. He's right, he said, breaking the silence. We've got to be better than this. That was all it took. A woman near the frozen foods, Mrs. Garcia, nodded. My dad fought in that same war, she said softly. He always told me, the only color that matters is the red on the flag. A young cashier, Ava, barely 20, called out from her register. I've never seen anyone handle something like that so gracefully. Thank you. Mrs. Thompson, visibly flustered, clutched her cart. She didn't apologize, but the fire in her eyes had dimmed. She started, I didn't mean, but stopped herself. Snoop's voice was gentle now. It's not about what you meant, he said. It's about how it came across. Words matter. Actions matter more. And with that, the moment had passed. But the impact? It would last far beyond that grocery store.